My story begins, I guess, from as far back as I can remember. As far as I never really had a normal relationship with food. I always was a little charged by food. I was always a little more excited about food, I think, than most kids were. And I guess probably in my teenage years, as I started to enter into puberty and started to, put on some weight, which was natural. I somehow got the message, though, that that wasn't okay. Um, and maybe that was an internal message, but, siblings have a way of finding your weak spots and pointing that out and making you really hyper aware of that. And I started dieting for the first time in junior high school, probably around, I think it was 8th grade. And I joined the YMCA with my dad, and we would go twice a week, and I would go to an aerobics class, and I started losing weight. And every week I would get into the car and I'd say, geez, Dad, I lost another, pound this week, or 2 pounds. And of course I was getting positive feedback for that, because, that was a good thing at that point. But it just kept going on and on and on. And I thought, if, a little is good, then more must be better. And so, I probably, I lost a good amount of weight there, probably 30, 40 pounds. And then an eating disorder just seemed to develop. I think the way that I understand is that, there's not one cause for an eating disorder, at least in my personal story. There's many causes, I think. I was a extremely sensitive child. A lot of things bothered me. I was very perceptive. I could read people. I had, a lot of insight. I could always read people quite well, with what they weren't saying. And I grew up in a family where, from the outside, we were a middle-class family and everything looked great, 2 kids and nice neighborhood. But, inside, there was dysfunction. There was non-communication. There were 2 people that were, my parents were together, but, my father didn't really want to be there. So although everything looks fine, it's not fine. And that, added more to my confusion, because I'm thinking, what is wrong here? I've got a family, my parents don't fight, everything should be okay, but I never felt right. And even from an early age, even before I started dieting, I would sneak food. I would sneak food into my room. And that was a really safe place for me to be. It would be in my room with, a package of cookies, and that calmed me down. That made me feel safe, because I didn't feel safe outside of my room a lot of times. And to be honest, I grew up feeling uncomfortable in my own skin. And, could never really figure out why. So as I started, again, mentioning, I was losing weight, and then before I know it, I start restricting different food groups and became a vegetarian, and became anorexic. And probably was anorexic for 9 months to a year, and got, well below 90 pounds. And finally, my friends at school contacted the school nurse, and she brought me down and had an intervention, and I was outed. So that began pretty much, me living in the world with an eating disorder that was no longer a secret. And I started therapy then. My first therapist, I mean, he just, from the moment I walked in, I didn't want to go. I was resistant to go anyway, so that's never a good sign. But from the moment I walked in, I just looked across the table at him, and I thought, nope. You're not going to be able to help me. And, he couldn't help me, or I wasn't even ready to be helped, or at that point. So over the course of the last 25 years, I have had, I guess, about 5 different therapists that I've worked with. And, only 2 of which really specialize in eating disorders. And I never really realized how important that is. But again, back in the early 80s when I was diagnosed, there weren't a lot of people that were, working in this field, and there weren't many treatment facilities. It was never recommended that I go to a treatment facility because, my health, albeit, I was very thin, my health wasn't compromised at that point. And interestingly enough, anorexia had a tight grip on me, like it does most people. And how I got out of it is there's sometimes it's a misconception that anorexics aren't hungry, and I was hungry all the time. I remember laying in bed and just not being able to sleep because I was so hungry at night. And I remember that it was pretty clear that I needed to gain weight because my parents were putting a lot of pressure on me, and I wasn't happy, obviously. So I started to eat, and I remember the first thing that I started to eat. I say I started to eat. Really, what I mean is I started to binge or compulsively overeat. Like the first thing I ate was butter, and I had deprived myself of butter for who knows how long. And I remember just eating it. I mean, gobs of it, to the point of my body was screaming like, "Oh, you're gonna get butter." So I really went from anorexia to the complete opposite, which would be compulsive overeating and binging, and spent probably the next 20 years battling that compulsive overeating, and sometimes dabbling back into some restricting behavior. But it has been an extremely painful journey. It's been extremely painful physically as well as emotionally because, the binging was more painful than restricting. And I can remember so many times of, eating to the point of no return. And this is just different than general overeating. This is to the point of physical pain that you can't get one single solitary morsel into your mouth. Or you literally explode. But I just remember the physical pain of that, which then spirals into emotional pain, and it just keeps going because then there's this self-loathing as you feel so bad about how much you ate, and then you eat more to compensate for that, to try to calm yourself down, and it just... and that was my coping mechanism. That was my coping mechanism for how I dealt with emotions. Be it sad, be it anxiety, be it frustration, be it anything, that was my coping mechanism. And that was how I pretty much learned how to deal with life, is using food. And from a very early age, because it was available, number one. Number two, food, just signified from my early days of nourishment, and something that I really wasn't receiving in my home on a nurturing basis. So, kids don't have many options of things to use. So for me, to cope, I chose food as my substance. I can tell you that I started working with a therapist about 2 years ago that finally, and I don't know another way to say it, but she finally had the key to unlock my heart. And she, from the first session we had it, and I'll be honest, the first time I walked in, I remember looking at her, and again, I have this habit of judging things very quickly. My first thought is, no, she's not going to be able to help me. By the end of the session, I felt completely different. But she tells me now that from the first session that we had, that she could look at me and she just saw this child in this 30-something year old body.